Welcome to the Two Testaments, a guided journey through Scripture with leading experts on the Bible, hosted by Ronnie Cosman and Will Kynes. Subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts or at the2testaments.com, where you can also donate to support our work. Follow us on Twitter at the2testaments on Facebook or Instagram.
Welcome to the Two Testaments podcast, a guided journey through Scripture. I'm Will Kynes.
And I'm Ronnie Cosman.
And in this episode, we're looking at Matthew 28, Matthew's account of Jesus' resurrection, and we are joined today by Dr. Terry Donaldson.
Terry Donaldson is Professor Emeritus of New Testament at Wycliffe College, which is at the University of Toronto, and he is one of our
Many Canadians on the
podcast. You know, the greatest interviewees are always the Canadians, right? And the greatest co-host is always the Canadian one. Terry is an accomplished scholar of the New Testament and has written many important works on Paul and on the Gospel of Matthew. Terry, I believe it's your first book, was titled Jesus on the Mountain, a study in Matthean theology, which was published by T&T Clark. And that's especially relevant since in Matthew 28, of course, we find Jesus and the disciples on a mountain. And Terry's also written important works on the identity of Gentiles in ancient Judaism and Christianity, including the book Judaism and the Gentiles with Baylor Press, and most recently, Gentile Christian Identity from Cornelius to Constantine, The Nations, The Parting of the Ways, and Roman Imperial Ideology, which came out with Eerdmans. Now, this question of the identity of the Gentiles is also very important for our discussion today of Matthew 28. Now, I have to say, I know Terry from my time doing my doctoral work at the University of Toronto, and Terry was just really generous with his time with me. I wanted to do a reading course on major interpreters of Paul, and so I approached Terry. I sent him an email saying, "Hey, would you be willing to supervise a directed reading course on that?" And now, Terry, I don't know what the compensation structure is like for directed reading courses, but I'm just going to assume that you did it out of the generosity of your heart. And so he would sit down with me over the course of a semester. We'd read these major interpreters on Paul, and then I'd get to talk to this accomplished New Testament scholar, and it was just wonderful to sit in his office and to hear him kind of talk through these major interpreters of Paul. And then he was also on my dissertation committee, and even after he retired, he still continued to read through my chapters and to give feedback. And he continues his generosity with his time with us on the podcast today. So thanks for joining us, Terry.
Well, thanks for the welcome. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, I look forward to getting a taste of what those meetings were like back there in Canada. Maybe there'll be less A's and boots and things like that in our conversation today. But I want to start with a question for you, Terry. More general, what first drew you to New Testament studies and to the Gospel of Matthew in particular?
I suppose I could say that my first degree was in physics and math, though I don't imagine that helps with the question very much at all. I grew up in a conservative Protestant environment, one that was Bible intensive, which meant that as I was coming of age, I had both an interest in the Bible and a lot of questions and issues that I needed to work through. I did well in school and think I was from an early age drawn to study and scholarship, but it took me a while to figure out that I could pursue that and wrestle with issues concerning the Bible, the early Christian movement, and so on. As a scholar, I did well in physics and math, and so I ended up doing a 4-year degree, pretty intensive degree in physics and math, but eventually realized that my questions lay elsewhere and began to pursue a scholarly career. Matthew was important in that. Though as far as method of thinking critically, there's a lot of transference from a science degree to the sort of work we do. A lot of backing and filling that needed to be carried out with respect to things that I missed by not doing a humanities degree. But I don't regret. Well, you don't get to choose where you start, really, and I don't regret that part of it at all.
So what about Matthew? Because, even if you decide I want to study the Bible, you've got 66 books in the Protestant canon to choose from. Why would you hone in on this one?
Yeah. Maybe it's because I had an overdose of Paul and the book of Revelation growing up. I was always attracted more to the synoptics than the Jesus that we see in the synoptics. With Matthew, it was his use of the Old Testament, or what I'd prefer to call the Scriptures of Israel now. Of course, beginning to look at that, there was a lot of puzzling things. The quotation about he will be called a Nazarene, which is pretty hard to track down. Or the one in chapter 21 in Jesus' entry into Jerusalem, where Matthew seems to depict Jesus as riding on two donkeys at once, which is pretty tricky. But Matthew became more interesting for me when I noticed something about the quotation, "Out of Egypt have I called my son," or "called my son out of Egypt." At first I wondered whether it was just another curious feature of Matthew, but when I looked at Hosea 11:1 and saw that the son was Israel, that seemed to suggest a number of connections in the first few chapters of Matthew. Actually, Wayne Baxter was speaking along these lines in a podcast that I saw recently. Serious, a little plug for him. The 40 days and 40 nights in the wilderness, of course, time in the Jordan River. But then noticing that all of the quotations that Jesus uses in this dialogue with the tempter aren't just randomly selected. They come from a short section in Deuteronomy where Moses is instructing the Israelites of the lessons that God was wanting them to learn during their sojourn in the wilderness. And he even says, "As a father disciplines his son, so have I been disciplining you." So that twigged me to the fact that there was more going on here. That part of the identity of Jesus as son had to do with an Israel kind of identity. Then in my first year of theological study in a fairly standard course on church history, I remember being struck by the fact that all of the people we were talking about in the 2nd and 3rd century, Justin and Irenaeus and Tertullian, Origen, were Gentiles. And it struck me, how did that come about that a movement that began totally within Judaism with the presentation of a Jewish Messiah so quickly became dominated by non-Jews? In the course of writing a paper for that or term paper for that course, I read Justin Martyr's dialogue with Trypho, Epistle of Barnabas, and then stumbled across James Park's book, The Conflict of the Church and the Synagogue, and then Jules Isaacs' Jesus in Israel, and encountered for the first time the adversus Ioudaiois argument in the early church, the argument against the Jews, especially in both the books by Parks and Isaac. They were dealing not only with history, but with the long legacy of anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism, and the effects of a supersessionist kind of reading of Israel's scripture today. So that's put a different slant on my interest in Matthew, but it certainly highlighted things in Matthew that were pertinent. Matthew's interest in the Gentiles with the Great Commission, the harsh polemic that we find against the Jewish leaders in Matthew, the cry of his blood be upon us and on our children, the cry of all the people. So all of a sudden I had quite an additional pile of issues and questions to wrestle with.
Right. Now, how do you see Matthew 28 fitting into the book as a whole?
Well, that's a great question, and I appreciate the fact that you've asked me to deal with chapter 28 rather than some other chapters that lie in between. Two things by way of response, one brief and one perhaps a little longer. First, as far as Matthew's themes are concerned, a lot of scholars have noted, long before I came along, that the concluding verses, the Great Commission scene, contains almost all of the things that are touched on are issues that are significant for Matthew. You know, you touch any item in that list, whether it's mountains or the disciples' worship of Jesus or their doubt or Jesus' authority or the abiding presence of Jesus, lights begin to go on all the way through the gospel. It's kind of a grand finale where a lot of Matthean themes get restated again in a climax. A second observation I make would have to do with the narrative shape of the gospel. And chapter 28 is the climax and conclusion of the story that readers have been working their way through, and the story that's been set in motion right at the beginning. My scholarly training was in redaction criticism, so it was reading Matthew from the perspective of identifying his sources and looking at the way in which he arranged and edited them. But in my early years of teaching, which also coincided with a new interest in narrative criticism and narrative readings, I began to find that approach was both very interesting to me, and also it was more useful in a classroom setting. So the old idea that goes back to Aristotle of stories having a beginning, a middle, and an ending, and that the narrative effects a completed process of change from the beginning to the end, struck me as both an interesting and very useful way of looking at the gospel.
So, Terry, you've been talking about narrative criticism and about reading kind of the Gospel of Matthew as a narrative. So could you talk a little bit about how you see particular features, let's say at the end of the narrative, at the climax of the narrative, how they dovetail with your kind of narratival reading of the Gospel?
Yeah, thanks for that. If I can begin a little bit at the beginning, narratives generally begin with some sort of a problem or an issue or a desideratum, something that's out of whack, if we can describe it in non-literary terms. And it introduces a main character. And the main character, of course, is Jesus. The issue that is important for the story to follow is, it comes to expression in two places. One, he will save his people from their sins. And then a little later, Jesus is the one who will shepherd my people Israel. So at the beginning of the gospel, one has this sense that Jesus is going to address a problem with respect to Israel and their situation with respect to sin and lack of a shepherd. And he's going to do that. Jesus is identified in a number of ways at the beginning of the gospel, but particularly, I think his identification as son is perhaps the broadest term that's introduced. Stories have complications, and one doesn't have to go far before we get into complications. One of them is the identity of Jesus' people. when you jump to the end of the gospel, Jesus' people seem to be a new community of disciples drawn from all the ethne, and there's a challenge of interpretation there, but either way, it's a people that now includes non-Jews or Gentiles. And so one of the questions that is there for readers as they begin to work their way through is what is the real nature of Jesus' people? How do Gentiles come to fit into it? The other, and this is the other thing, I'll say it briefly, and we might want to get into it, is, and it arises out of the temptation narrative, particularly where you get the idea that there are two definitions of sonship going on for Matthew. One is the royal, kingly, messianic son. You were my son, this day I have begotten you, kind of thing. And in the temptation narrative, Satan seems to be pressing Jesus to the logical conclusion to that identity. If you were the son, then there are certain regal, royal things that are yours to command. The idea of power and divine protection. Jesus answers those from the perspective of the humble, obedient son that Israel was called to be. So one of the tensions that works its way through the narrative is the interplay between those two. Satan's role comes up again in after Peter's confession, and then the mockers at the cross. If you are the Son of God, then you've got the power to come down. So one of the issues for readers is, if Jesus is going to be faithful to the humble, obedient sonship, how is he going to be able of any saving use to his people? So as the story begins, you have the basic problem that Jesus is to address, but almost immediately there are these complications, and it's how those complications play out in the story and how they are brought to some sort of a satisfying conclusion in the final chapter that is the experience of reading Matthew.
And hopefully we'll see some of that as we move through the chapter now. But before we get into moving through the chapter verse by verse, as it were, I'd be interested to hear from you, as someone who's thought a lot about this chapter. Is there something that you find very difficult to understand, and how do you understand that difficulty?
Well, the major difficulty is how to translate ethne in chapter 28. Jesus says, "All authority in heaven and earth has been given to me. Go therefore and discipleize all the ethne." In Jewish usage, ethne commonly is used to refer to the non-Jewish nations. And even by Jesus' day, non-Jewish individuals, as I point out in other contexts, when Paul in Galatians says that when before James, the James group came, Peter was quite happy to eat with the ethne. Paul's not talking there about ethnic groups, nations. He's talking about individuals. So a common use of ethne in Jewish context is non-Jews, Gentiles, which gives us the reading, "Go and make disciples of all the Gentiles," which for many has led to an anti-Jewish culmination to the story that, God has sent the Messiah to Israel. Israel has rejected the Messiah. All the people claim responsibility for his death. And so in the end, God abandons Israel and turns to a new people among the Gentiles. So Matthew, read that way, could feed very easily into the kind of supersessionistic story against the Jews. The broader use of the term is nations in general. And so, at least for a long time, I've been more partial to the view that what we have going on in chapter 28 is an expansion. Go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel in the earlier part of the gospel. Now go to all the nations, Israel included. So it's an expansion of the mission. Israel is included, but sort of with a reduced status, one nation among others. So that to me is the toughest.
Okay. Yeah. Well, why don't we try to resolve it?
In chapter 28.
Yeah, I was going to say, why don't we try to resolve it when we get through to that part of the chapter? I think that'll be interesting for us to deal with it then.
So keep listening.
Yes,
we will get there.
The resurrection account in Mark 16 is much more abbreviated compared to Matthew's account. Mark ends with the angel telling the women to go tell the disciples that Jesus has been raised and that they will see him in Galilee. And then the Gospel of Mark ends like this. So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid.
And just a note here, some people will have more at the end of the Gospel of Mark, but there'll be a note that says the most reliable manuscripts don't include.
Sure, yes, yeah. I think most scholars regard the shorter ending to be the kind of original. Now, although Jesus' resurrection is asserted by the angel, right? The angel says that Jesus is resurrected, right, to them, and he's going to meet them in Galilee. There is no actual resurrection appearance of Jesus in Mark. Now, do you have some thoughts, Terry, or suggestions why you think Mark's account ends the way it does and why Matthew's account is extended beyond Mark's in the way that it is? And maybe this gets to some of the kind of redactional criticism issue that you were interested in, right? If Matthew has Mark as a source, why does he do what he does with the resurrection appearance? Why not just leave it in the way Mark has it?
I'm quite partial to Mark's ending, or at least I find it very effective. I don't know if it was the intention of the evangelist, but to end the gospel as abruptly as it starts is interesting because, as you've already suggested, Mark has provided readers with the information they need to fill in the ending. Jesus on 3 occasions has foretold his resurrection. The angel has said, you will see them. Jesus in chapter 14 says, after I'm raised, I'll go ahead of you into Galilee. So there's all this expectation that's been raised as to what's going to happen after the crucifixion of Jesus. You know, as a reader, you could imagine an ideal or intended reader getting to the end and saying, huh, what? Oh yeah, I'm reading this, so I guess the women got over their silence and told people about it, and the gospel has been proclaimed, and here's the gospel written.
Right.
Whether that's Mark's intention or not, who can say? But as far as the experience of reading, it can be a very effective way of ending the story. Matthew evidently thought there was more to say. He certainly wants to have accounts of the risen Jesus meeting not only the 12 or the 11 in Galilee, but the women outside the tomb. A couple of other things going on in Matthew's ending. One is this 3-part narrative about the guards at the tomb. That's set up in chapter 27, where the chief priests or the priests, Jewish leaders anyhow, approach Pilate and say, let's make sure there's no way that the disciples can steal the body and then go and tell the people that he's been raised from the dead, and we'll be in a worse mess than we were before.
Yeah, let me read that. That's in verses 62. It says, the next day, that is after the day of preparation, the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered before Pilate and said, Sir, We remember what that impostor said while he was still alive. After 3 days, I will rise again. Therefore, command the tomb to be made secure until the third day. Otherwise, his disciples may go and steal him away and tell the people he has been raised from the dead, and the last deception would be worse than the first. Pilate said to them, You have a guard of soldiers. Go. Make it as secure as you can. So they went with the guard and made the tomb secure by sealing the stone.
Yeah, thank you. Just a parenthetical comment that the cry of all the people in 27:25, all the people cried, His blood be on us and on our children, is not the last time that we hear of the people in Matthew. There is this really ironic statement that you've just read. The leaders obviously think that they're going to be able to forestall the people hearing that Jesus has risen from the dead, and that the result would be worse than Jesus' own preaching. The irony there suggests sort of the reality, the opposite reality from Matthew's perspective, that the word has gone out to the people and many of them have rallied around Jesus. So this cry of all the people isn't the last word on the people in Matthew. Matthew wants to tell that story, which he does in 3 parts. The earthquake and the appearance of the angel at the tomb causes the guards to collapse like dead men, and then the Jewish leaders bribe the guards to keep quiet about it, and if the word gets to the governor, they would take care of it. So Matthew has this sort of apologetic story. The one certain historical bit to it is that there did circulate in Matthew's environment the more scurrilous claim that the disciples were perpetrating a fraud by stealing the body. So that's one thing that Matthew wants to work in. The other is this sort of a highlighting of the eschatological significance of everything that's going on, which includes the strange story of the graves being opened and the saints being raised and the saints going marching into Jerusalem, as it were.
And why does that happen there instead of with Jesus' resurrection? Why does it happen at the moment of his crucifixion?
Yeah, it's doubly odd because the tombs are open and they're raised, but they have to wait around until the resurrection has actually happened to go into Jerusalem. It's an odd account. I think as far as the narrative is concerned, it's part of the eschatological embroidery, if I can call it that includes, well, also the fact that the messenger at the tomb is an angel, and that it's an earthquake that rolls the stone away, and that's what causes the guards to collapse. So there are things that Matthew wants to weave into the concluding part of the story, in addition to, I think what's the main element is the appearances of Jesus and the commissioning of the disciples.
Right. So in addition to the commissioning of the disciples, it sounds like, if I'm understanding correctly, that you see Matthew, it seems, more concerned than Mark about giving an apologetic for Jesus' resurrection, a defense of it. And so he includes the story of the securing of the tomb as a way to kind of, I guess, defend that, look, even with the tomb having been really secured, Jesus, the empty tomb indicates that the disciples didn't steal the body, but there must have been some kind of supernatural event, or and that is the resurrection for Matthew. Does that sound right?
Yeah, and perhaps, well, it's not only us disciples that witnessed this, but there were many others as well who were raised, which is just, why a resurrection before the resurrection, but who were raised and were seen by many. So there are apologetic threads going through that as well.
And Mark seems not as concerned with having to shore up that kind of apologetic account for whatever reason. We don't necessarily know why, but for some reason Matthew is concerned about it. Because, would you say it's because there is these kind of like counter narrative going on about the empty tomb?
Yeah, the statement, this report has been spread abroad among the Judeans or the Jews to this day, I think provides a little window into Matthew's environment. Now, that's a statement that could be read as evidence that Matthew is Gentile, and he's not Jewish.
Right.
This story has been spread abroad among those people, but I think it's more a reflection that Matthew is aware that there are Jews and Gentiles among his readership, and he's providing perhaps some sort of inside information that Gentile readers would not necessarily have been privy to. Mark is much more prepared to leave us with a mysterious Jesus, and with puzzles that need to be worked at and figured out.
In Matthew 28, Galilee is repeatedly mentioned. The angel appears to Mary Magdalene and the other Mary, shows them that the burial place is empty, and tells them to then go tell the disciples that Jesus has been raised and that he's going ahead of them to Galilee, in verse 7. And then Jesus himself reiterates this when he appears to the women, that the disciples will meet him in Galilee, in verse 10. And then in verse 16, we're told that the 11 disciples went to Galilee. Seems like Matthew really wants us to know something about Galilee. Why do you think Galilee is so important here for Matthew and for the Gospel of Matthew?
Well, if he's depending on Mark, Galilee has already been identified as the place where Jesus would meet the disciples. So there's it may be no more than that, but it might be a counterpart, I guess, to the statement in chapter 4, Galilee of the Gentiles, a light has dawned. It might be a kind of a Galilean bookends to the gospel as a whole, that the ministry of Jesus begins in Galilee, and there's some sort of connection to the ethne, to the Gentiles, and the new stage of the mission is commissioned in Galilee as well.
Now, when Matthew tells us in verses 11-15 that, again, the story was circulated among the Judeans to this day, the Greek term that the NRSV translates as Judeans is contested among scholars, as you well know, and the issue is how to translate the Greek term, right, Ioudaiois or Ioudaiois in general, right? This is a general problem that New Testament scholars have been grappling with. Some scholars think that we should translate the term in the traditional way as the Jews, right? And then other scholars prefer Judeans. Can you maybe briefly indicate to us what's at stake in these different suggestions, and then without getting lost too far in the weeds, maybe tell us how you prefer to translate the term here in Matthew 28 more specifically?
The issue has to do in part, I think, with the common assumption among scholars to think about Jews and Judaism as representing a kind of entity that's parallel to Christian and Christianity. In other words, we have two kinds of religions going on here. One is the Christian religion, and those who are part of it are Christians. The other is the Jewish religion, Judaism, and those who are part of it are Jews. I think it's Christopher Stendhal who said that we are led astray more by what we think we know than by what we don't know. And the assumption that we can conceive of Jews and Judaism in a manner analogous to Christians and Christianity, inventing a new category called religion in the process, is part of what's going on in that discussion. The realities that we have to deal with primarily in the ancient world have to do with ethnic groups, nations in their sense of the term, not ours, so that a Jew or a Syrian or a Macedonian is part of a people group that's identified with a language and a set of customs and an area. Feeds into my interests to a certain extent, because I think that in study of the New Testament, the categories of Jews and Gentiles is a much more significant category than Jews and Christians, or at least a more pertinent one. I appreciate the arguments that are made by some scholars that Judean is a rendering that would be much more in keeping with ancient use that would talk about Macedonians or Scythians or Galatians than Jews. Contemporary Jewish scholars object to some extent to that use because it is seen as effacing Jewish identity and the Jewish reality in these scriptures. So it's a complicated identity kind of issue that's going on.
So if you translate it Judean, the focus then is more on the geographical location rather than the religious affiliation.
I think it's not strictly geographical, but it's an ethnic term. It has to do with a people group, and that generally from the time of Herodotus is understood as involving a land, involving a shared history, involving a set of customs, customs and traditions, some of which have to do with the divine or the gods. But those cluster of terms that constitute ethnicity are what's wrapped up in the term Judean from the standpoint of ancient use, which isn't carried through really with the translation Jew today.
Right. Because we tend to, when we use the language Jew, we tend to think, I think many people just think kind of religious connotations. Though I think even the English term can carry with it, I think, ethnic connotations and, particular ancestral traditions and customs. Maybe Judean kind of jostles us out of only attaching the religious aspects.
Yeah, there's a place for interpretations and readings that defamiliarize texts, let us see things that may have been obscured by just the well-worn translational paths that we've inherited.
So where the rubber meets the road here.
How do you?
What would you propose here as the translation? Do you prefer Judean or do you?
I can see arguments either way, and I don't have a strong feeling either way.
Sure.
I think it would be the kind of footnote that I would write to a translation that would allow me to kind of equivocate as I'm doing right now.
Okay, so you could go with either, but how would you want to explain the identity of the Ioudaiois here, amongst whom this report has been circulating?
Yeah, I'm not sure that it's restricted to geography, that Matthew was just talking about a group in Judea. I think it's a more general term. I see it as whether you translate it as Jew or Judean, I think the author of the first gospel is a Jew or Judean, but here he's addressing a mixed ethnic group, saying that among the Jews, Judeans, this sort of an argument against our shared Christian belief has been spread.
Now, in verses 16 to 20, so we're now moving on to Matthew 28, 16 to 20, and there the 11 disciples are now in Galilee, and they arrive at, we're told in verse 16, the mountain to which Jesus had directed them. Now, mountains are an important site. They're very significant in Matthew and elsewhere in Scripture and ancient literature. Could you maybe briefly tell us why are mountains so important in the ancient world, and why are they important for Matthew in particular?
Maybe I should preface my comments. I'll preface my comments by saying that after I'd finished my dissertation on the mountain motif in Matthew's Gospel, the job that was available to me was smack dab in the middle of the Canadian prairies in Saskatoon. Something that I've often wondered was some sort of divine irony at work. Be that as it may, yes, mountains are very they're significant in Scripture, with Sinai and Zion in particular coming to mind, and others as well. And in Matthew, we've got a whole string of them, or chain of mountains, where significant things happen. The third temptation, the tempter takes Jesus up to a high mountain and shows him all of the kingdoms of the earth and offers them on certain terms. The Sermon on the Mount, where the crowds and the disciples gather to Jesus, and he engages in this extended teaching about discipleship. In chapter 15, there's a scene that's quite unique to Matthew, 15:29 to 31, which actually it's a crowd that gathers to Jesus for healing, and it's the crowd that experiences one of the feeding miracles to follow. Then there's the Transfiguration, a very high mountain. Jesus is declared to be divine Son. The Olivet Discourse, where the disciples ask about the signs of Jesus coming and the end of the age, and then the Great Commission. I think there's two things going on with Matthew's mountain. One is that, well, there are significant things that happen. They have to do either with Jesus' identity and authority, the third temptation, the Transfiguration, the Great Commission, or they have to do with the gathering of the new community of disciples and crowds. All of that in an eschatological kind of context. I tend to think that the primary backdrop for Matthew's mountain scenes are the Zion traditions. The location of the temple, the place where the king is enthroned, the place from which the Torah will go out in the last days, the place where a banquet will be served for the nations. I think that these themes that come into view in Matthew resonate most strongly with Zion themes. Now, Dale Allison is one who has argued strongly for a new Moses motif in Matthew, and he has taken me to friendly task with my emphasis on not on Moses but on Zion, and I take his point. I was writing a dissertation where you feel, at least I felt, I had to defend myself from all comers and argue that no, this is Zion and nothing else. I'm much more mellowed in my in my interpretation since then. So yeah, there certainly are Mosaic and Sinai themes going on, but I still think that for Jewish readers in the first century, Zion would have figured much more prominently in everyday life as the location of the temple, and that it resonates more strongly with what Matthew sees as going on there. The other thing that I think is going on is that there are interesting connections between various ones of the first 5 mountain scenes and the Great Commission. What Satan offers in the Transfiguration narrative, all authority, well, he doesn't use the word authority, but all of these kingdoms are yours, is rejected by Jesus because it kind of short circuits the kind of path of sonship that he's called on to walk. But in the Great Commission scene, having followed the path of obedience, and suffering to the end, the risen Jesus can proclaim, all authority has in heaven and earth has been given to me. Go and discipleize all the nations, teaching them to observe everything I've commanded you. Well, where do you find making disciples of them and teaching to observe what I command you? Where do you find the concentrated teaching on discipleship but the Sermon on the Mount? Jesus' exaltation as divine Son, the Transfiguration narrative is kind of repeated in a hierarchy in the Great Commission. It's not without significance that the Christological term there is Son. So I think that there are these interconnected thematic resonances between the various mountain scenes.
Right.
So that's my thesis, and I'm sticking to it.
Yeah, I think I actually like the Zion motif that you're pulling on, especially, I really see that, the enthronement, right? Which is, Matthew 28, 18, 20 is very royal, with all authority in heaven and earth being given to him, which is really royal. I think that can be missed. And then the Torah to the nations, Israel's law to the nations, I think that really kind of hits on, I think what's going on with, discipling and teaching the nations to obey all that Jesus has commanded as a kind of way of bringing the nations to Zion, right, and the law going forth from Zion to the nations.
Yeah, and I never heard this before now, but the all authority has been given to me when the devil offers to give him all the kingdoms. I buy that too, so I think you'd pass your defense if Ronnie and I were on the committee. Now, do you include Golgotha amongst your mountains in Matthew, the Mount of Crucifixion? Is that one of the mountains?
I went looking for that mountain, on a hill far away, Golgotha. There is a green hill far away, but there's no indication that I could find in the Gospels or early Christian tradition that the site of the crucifixion was a hill or a mountain. Now it comes in later on, and I think it's similar to developing Jewish tradition that has important biblical scenes later relocated to a mountain, often Mount Zion, the site of the temple. Adam's creation, for example, I'd have to look it up, but in one tradition is located at I think Mount Zion, the site of Mount Zion. Something similar is even going on with Jacob's. The account of Jacob's stone pillow. So I think it's a later tradition that develops perhaps in tandem or over against a Jewish concentration of significant events at Mount Zion.
Yeah, so it's a kind of indirect support for your view, though, in that because mountains were considered so important, and since this was an important event in the end, they put it on a mountain.
Even if it wasn't.
Even if it wasn't actually in the gospel on a
Interesting.
mountain. Yeah, that's interesting. Now, in verse 17, we read that when the disciples come and meet with Jesus in Galilee, it says they worshipped him, but some doubted. And this is just a fascinating verse. You have these disciples meeting Jesus. So let's talk about those two responses to Jesus, worship and doubt. How do you understand those two responses, and how would you like those translations? Would you propose different translations for what's happening there?
Well, the translation worship puts this into a divine kind of, I guess there's hero worship in our home context as well. But the word that's used here is not restricted to the kind of worship that is given to a divinity. In one of Jesus' parables, a servant, I think it's one of the parables about indebtedness, falls at the master's knees, and the word there is proskuneo, to show reverence or submission. So it certainly is it doesn't necessarily have divine connotations, though the earliest one of the early appearances of the words is in the temptation. You will worship the Lord your God, and God only will you serve. So there are divine connotations that are attached to the word from the beginning. I would be happy with the term reverenced Jesus here, but I don't think worship is out of place.
So it could be it could be reverence in the sense of that's what you do to a royal figure, or you prostrate yourself before them. But you're suggesting it could also have the connotation of reverencing the divine as well.
Especially in the temptation narrative, Jesus has kind of upped the stakes by saying, "God only will you worship." So it has that kind of content. I'm not trying to import a very high Christology into Matthew, but the term does have that resonance. As far as,
and then what about doubt? It just doesn't. It's kind of jarring. Here we have the disciples finally encountering the resurrected Jesus, and their responses to doubt.
But it's not out of keeping with the disciples in Matthew. They are pictured as doubting. I think it's when Peter's walking on the water, he begins to doubt and begins to sink. The term oligopistos, of little faith, is the characteristic, Jesus' characteristic criticism of the disciples. Right to the end, the combination of reverence and doubt is one that we should recognize by now in the gospel. So those are two of the elements in the Great Commission passage that pick up themes that go through the gospel as a whole.
Now, Jesus then says to them, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all the ethne, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything that I have commanded you. And remember, I am with you always to the end of the age. Now, as the ending of the Gospel of Matthew, we've touched on this a little bit. I wonder if you could give us kind of the highlight. How does this kind of capstone of the Gospel relate to what happens elsewhere in Matthew? How does it sum it up and tie it to its kind of climactic goal?
Well, taking individual parts of that statement, the authority of Jesus is something that's emphasized throughout. They were amazed because he taught as one who had authority and not as their scribes. If you do a concordance search on authority, that's a highlighted feature of Jesus. Make disciples. Other commissioning statements have different wording. Preach the gospel. In Matthew, the making of disciples picks up an important aspect of the gospel as a whole. The emphasis on disciples and discipleship, teaching them to observe everything that I've commanded. Jesus as teacher, as giving of commands, of an interpretation of the Torah. All of those are characteristic features of Jesus' activity in the gospel. I am with you always functions as kind of a bookend to Emmanuel, God with us at the outset. And even to the end of the age, that phrase comes up quite repeatedly, including the Olivet Discourse. So individually, those elements, as I said earlier, highlight aspects that are already part of the gospel earlier. But it does represent sort of the culmination of the two complications that were apparent at the beginning of the gospel. One of them had to do with Jesus' twofold identity as Son, and the sense on the part of a first-time reader that, well, if Jesus is going to insist on a path that leads to suffering and death, how is he going to save anyone? Well, that path having followed through to the end, Jesus can declare, now all authority has been given to me, and initiate the command for a new people. Likewise with the Gentiles.
We wanted you to solve that one for us, right? The translation of the ethne.
As I say, I used to prefer the reading, go and make disciples of all the nations. So it's an expansion of the command that Jesus gave the disciples in chapter 10. But I just simply find it harder to justify that translation of the term ethne here. For one thing, the parallel with the command to the disciples in chapter 10, don't go to the ethne, with chapter 28, go to the ethne, seems to suggest that it's talking about the same thing. Also, in my I've done a very thorough search of all of the places where all the ethne or kol hagoyim, all the goyim appear in Jewish writings, and the vast majority of them refer to non-Jewish nations. And then there's the fact that the ethne in Jewish usage is used to talk about individuals as well as ethnic groups. I'm not sure that you can baptize ethnic groups or discipleize ethnic groups or teach them. It seems to be that individuals are more in view in that kind of activity. So I'm inclining to a view that's come to expression more recently in Anders Runeson's work on Matthew and Matthias Conrad's work, where the feeling is that Matthew presents us with two missions that are going to last until the end of the age. There's the mission to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, which is going to last until the parousia of the Son of Man. The mission to all the Gentile nations, the remaining world, that's going to last until the end of the age. So it's not that one mission has just come to an untimely conclusion and been replaced by a Gentile mission, but Matthew sees two missions going on in parallel fashion to the end of the age. Now, a lot of time has happened between Matthew's writing and now, and what sense we make of that in our own day. is another large question. But I'm more inclined to read it as something that has to do with the restriction of the mission now being lifted, so that there's also a mission going to the non-Jews, the Gentiles, the Gentile nations.
Yeah, great. And you mentioned a little bit about Christology when you were when you mentioned the citation of Emmanuel, right? God with us earlier in Matthew's Gospel, and how that's echoed here with Jesus saying, "I'm with you always to the end of the age." And then there's also this triadic formula that some people point to as well, right? They baptize in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Spirit, right? That comes along with that "I am with you always." How do you see those things playing into Matthew's Christology? I mean, is it a high Christology that kind of includes him into the identity of Israel's God, or is it not as high as some people think? I mean, this is a kind of debate in New Testament scholarship.
One measure of it, I suppose, would be to ask if Matthew has any sense of pre-existence, of the Son being a pre-existent entity that becomes incarnate. And I don't find any clear hint or suggestion of that in Matthew or in any of the synoptics. But there is an aura around Jesus that, from Matthew's perspective, that helps one understand how that kind of a step could well have been made before too long. Now, a certain amount of defamiliarization probably needs to go on. If you turn to the baptismal narrative, you've got the Father, the Son, and the Spirit acting. So Jesus and the Spirit and Jesus and the Father are commonly juxtaposed in Matthew. So the statement here, if we understand it going forward from Matthew rather than backwards from centuries of later baptismal formulations, may fit more authentically into a Matthean kind of world.
And finally, on the Great Commission, as it's called, is there any misconception or misperception of this passage that you would want to correct or adjust in the way that it's commonly understood?
I don't know if it's a misconception, but when you think about the history that's unfolded between the end of Matthew's Gospel and today, and see what can happen in a world that still exists this side of the reign of God, when one identifies too unquestionably with power and authority, then there are dangers that can emerge. I mean, there are all sorts of overtones to those comments, and some of them are picked up in my book on Gentile Christian identity, where Gentile Christians redefine themselves in such a way as to present themselves first as a counter nation. Christ is a better way of gathering all the nations into a new empire. And then when Constantine comes along, this counter nation becomes a ready-made partner for empire, with consequences that, while not entirely negative, certainly have been significantly negative. So just maybe a call to Christians to identify as as fully with the humble, obedient son, the servant, the suffering servant of Isaiah, who also comes into view in Matthew's gospel, as with the all-authoritative, exalted, empowered son. We're not there yet.
Yeah, that's great. Well, one final question that we have for you is one we like to ask all of our guests, which is for a blurb. Some kind of recommendation. Now, it could be a book, and we're familiar with blurbs on books. They're very common. But it could be anything else. It could be a movie or a TV show, or we've received several blurbs for life hacks of various sorts. So something that you've just found helpful recently that you think our listeners might find helpful as well.
Well, I do have one book like that, but before that, here a book that I occasionally think I might like to write, though only in my imagination. I'm certainly not the only one who has a secret envy of other academics who are able to write a book that crosses over from the narrow scholarly world and becomes a bestseller. I won't name any names here. I've long since realized that any books of mine, I sometimes introduce myself rather tongue-in-cheek as I'm a scholar and an author of rare books. But I do have this fanciful idea of writing a book that, well, what sells? Books that do with food and diet are pretty guaranteed to be bestsellers. Books that deal with fashion and dress. So what I'm thinking of is John the Baptist's Guide to Diet and Dress. It could be on the shelf besides, My Year of Living Biblically or something like that. My Year of
This is a blurb for an imaginary hypothetical book. Or a blurb, a life hack, which is look to John the Baptist for some suggestions on diet.
Or not.
Very briefly, I've recently read John Kloppenborg's book. I'm going to get the title right. Christ's Associations, Connecting and Belonging in the Ancient City. As Ronnie will well know, John and his students for several decades now have been investigating this whole array of associations, clubs and guilds and neighborhood groups and ethnic groups that existed kind of in between the household at one level and the Greek and Roman city at the higher level. And there's all sorts of information on them. The early Christ groups, the early ecclesiae, would have resembled groups like that from the outside. John's work, he's not trying to shoehorn early churches into just a narrow pattern of associations, but rather he's trying to use the broad array of information that we have on groups like this in order to stimulate our imagination and make more out of the evidence that we do have for Paul's ecclesia. So how they attracted new members, where they met, how they paid for their activities, how they ate together, what sort of social capital was available to those who were part of their groups. How did they deal with conflict? I mean, all of these things that come into view, especially in the Corinthian correspondence. We're not going to find answers to them in the study of associations, but we're going to have a whole pile of useful parallels and information that can be useful. It's written at there's some technical parts to it, but it's written at a quite an accessible level, and it's kind of a culmination of these 3 decades of work that's been going on.
Great. Well, thank you, Terry. Thanks for taking the time to walk us through this last chapter of Matthew's Gospel. and for taking us up on the mountain. And thanks to our listeners, to you, if you have enjoyed coming up the mountain with us and with Terry. Please go on Apple Podcasts.
This is our great commission to our listeners, right? Go therefore.
And give us a 5-star rating, as many as you can, and disciple all the
other potential listeners out there.
right.
Yeah, I don't know about that. Well, thanks, Terry, and thanks for listening.
And thanks to you as well. It's been quite enjoyable.
The Two Testaments is produced with support from Samford University, where Ronnie Cosman and Will Kynes are professors in the Department of Biblical and Religious Studies. Thanks to you, our fellow travelers, who support this journey by donating on our website, thetwotestaments.com. Thanks also to Cam Thomas, Joe Zelder, and the team in the Samford Faculty Success Center, and our student assistants for their help with production, editing, and promotion.